Already. So welcome to 100 Talk. This is the 100 Thieves fan cast. I'm Cole.
I'm Jordan.
And we're here with a very, very special episode where we have the coolest guest in the statistical world here with us today, which we'll get to in just a minute. Jordan, how are you feeling about this week?
Oh, what a week. I mean, it was fun. It was a fine week.
We had Academy announcements.
Yeah, I was really excited to see that actually, because that was kind of a question mark. But now it just makes sense.
Yeah, we are now Team Stunt Mountain.
Stunt Mountain.
Yeah.
That's I love that meme that you've created that we'll try to push for the rest of the season.
Did we reach meme status with that now?
I don't know. We need some kind of a GIF or a JPEG at least. Probably. I'll put something together.
Everybody, put your heads together. Let's get on this.
Stunt Mountain Pinnacle. What's the height of that?
Summit.
We'll come up with. See, what's the summit?
Oh man. Well, yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about Academy, I think, on our next show, or a show that will shortly follow that. But here we are here to do a kind of statistical deep dive on the team. Talk a little bit about how 2018 went, and a lot about how 2019 is going to go, because we cannot contain our excitement. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, and I'm not a statistics major, but if there's one thing I know, it's that it's the only way to see the future. So I'm just really excited for us to hear the definitive version of what happens next year. And I think it's going to be really good. So,
you are hard committing. You are hard committing Tim right now. I feel so bad for this man.
I'm kidding, of course. I'll let you do the statistics disclaimer on none of this is, this is not a crystal ball. This is just it's our best guess. But I gotta think, right? The best guess is it's probably a lot better than what I would come up with. So it's exciting to have somebody who actually knows these things here.
Exactly. And with that, let's go ahead and bring on our guest. Welcome, Tim.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Tim, we need you to clear the air, man. How do you pronounce the last name?
Go nice and simple, actually. When we anglicized it, like to make it nice and easy, just go with Sevenhuysen.
Sevenhuysen.
Sevenhuysen. Actually, within my family, we sometimes go Huysen instead of Husen. But it's even myself. I almost 50-50 it, but go figure.
There are factions within your family. The Husens,
to some extent.
Poisons,
we've never openly discussed it. Maybe I should bring it up at Christmas.
Yeah. The classic Husen versus Huysen battle.
Yeah, we'll read about it in the news, I'm sure.
Yeah. All 24 of us around the world.
Well, welcome, Tim. Do you want to do a few minutes? Tell us, who you are, what you do, how you got into being this unique, statistical magical man that you are.
Well, you're the one who described me that way, so I'll just leave it at that.
Hey, book it.
Yeah, we're ready to give you the title, Statistical Magical Man. You can put it in your Twitter bio.
So my background in esports started in around early 2015. I was just a player of League of Legends, a fan of the esport, and I happened to kind of stumble across a way to get at some of the data from the professional matches, and I found that there was very little out there where people were doing anything with this data, even though it was possible to start collecting it. So I created my own website. I created Oracle's Elixir. I started posting those stats and aggregating them. I just started with the NALCS, and then as I kind of improved my tools and so on, I started supporting more leagues, got a little bit better, access to a little more data, and went a little more in depth. And of course, I started doing content around that data. I wrote some articles, did some infographics. That led to some freelance opportunities. So I wrote for Unicorn, I wrote for The Score, some things like that. After doing that for a while, I also worked with Fnatic as a statistical consultant during their 2015 run during the summer split and World Championships. So kind of got involved a little bit with the team, just in a supporting role. I don't want to oversell myself too much.
It was really all Tim, guys. All right, we'll come out and say it.
Had nothing to do with Uni, Reign over Febivin. None of those guys really meant anything. Reckless. With the right numbers behind them, any player can be a reckless. But no, so I supported those guys a little bit, and then early 2017, I got involved with a project called Shadow, which is a professional esports analytics platform. We support League of Legends as well as Counter-Strike and Dota, and we're used by many of the top teams in the world. So we provide various kind of tools, services that those teams use for their match preparation, for tracking and analyzing scrims, data visualization, all kinds of things like that. So that's my day to day now is running Shadow and our team on that. And I still do Oracle's Elixir, kind of maintain it on the side, make some data available to everyone, the broader community and the fans and so on. It's just a fun, kind of exciting place to be.
Yeah, I like how you have the two, the split, because Oracle's Elixir is like for the normies, and then you've got like the pro product. Actually, and our listeners may remember that we've referenced Oracle's Elixir several times on this podcast. We're, talking about some of the unique stats that you've created. As I understand it, you personally just came up with, some of the key stats there. And I originally heard it on the Dive, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So this is definitely something that has been very helpful to the community and cool for us. And so now to have you on the show, it's kind of like, all right, cool. Let's ask this guy who actually knows what he's talking about.
It's pretty interesting.
Questions that we want to answer. Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty interesting, the different, when I was focusing more on Oracle's Elixir and my own content, the writing I would do, creating new statistics and so on, that opened a lot of doors and relationships with, people like the guys on the Dive, casters and those types of analysts, and some really cool relationships there and opportunities to work with them and talk with them. Now that I'm, focused more on Shadow, I spend more of that time with coaches and with professional analysts who are a little bit more behind closed doors. They don't go out and broadcast the things we talk about because it's very different, right? Different subjects and a bit of a different purpose to it. But it's been a really exciting ride the past 4 or so years doing this kind of stuff, and the places I've been able to go and attend some conferences and all that kind of stuff. It's a lot of fun.
So you're basically telling us that we've got like security clearance of some sort now. It's like classified stuff that we're going to spill out, huh?
Yeah,
I'll go check the NDAs on the relationships with, with our Shadow clients. But
there's that one asterisk that says if you're on a podcast, just don't worry about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Free game. Yeah. It sounds like Shadow's a little bit more data science versus the Oracle's Elixir, which is just like introductory stats course for me to play with and pretend I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, to some extent, you could put it that way. To some extent, like Oracle's Elixir is meant to really summarize things and make them accessible to a lot of people. So, we have a lot of big tables of data up there. I try to keep them not too wide. I could have 3 or 4 or 20 times as many columns worth of data, but I try to avoid that to make it overwhelming on Shadow. I don't have to worry about that. People they're going to dig and give them as much to dig through as they possibly can. But in a different way, Shadow is actually a very different beast. We do a lot more things with visualization. We do a lot of things with accessing data that the public should never see. So anything to do with scrims, and tracking that, solo queue automation stuff. When you go to Counter-Strike, of course, it's a completely different beast. That's much more visualization heavy.
Yeah,
a whole different family of statistics and so on. And Dota, again, data access in Dota is completely different from League. So it's a big set of different problems that all have to get solved in sometimes similar ways. But
sure. Well, with that, I feel like this is a good time to jump into some of the more league specific questions we had come up with. And I think the most useful thing for me in this podcast is just to get a sense from you on how I can better think about some of the statistics I hear. I feel like they get thrown around a lot. So I'm always interested in understanding how I can better kind of analyze from my my layperson's seat. So when you look at just kind of the 3 to 5 different things that you feel are the best approximation of how good a player is, what would you say falls into that category?
Yeah, so I'd say like the response to this question is actually maybe a little bit of a twist, actually, which is that I would probably, in sports statistics in general, and especially in League of Legends statistics, I would almost never recommend that you let a number form very much of your opinion about how good a player is. The numbers in League of Legends are, the majority of their value comes from telling you what a player might be good at, or what style they play, even more so. They give you a lot of context. So the stats in League of Legends are almost always contextual. They're almost always meant to support something, and you have to pair them with with observational analysis. You have to pair them with other factors. So as something as simple as, you'd think that an AD carries damage output stats, whether it's damage per minute, share of teams damage, something like that, seems like it should be pretty straightforward. But when you leave aside all of the difficulties in kind of normalizing damage, the number of opportunities you have to deal damage, how late in the game it is, changes how much damage you're doing. You leave all those things aside, and you have to look at things like which champions are they playing, which champions are they playing against. It gets as subtle as, if they're playing against a lineup with a lot of tanks, are those health tanks or armor tanks? Because against armor tanks, you're actually doing less damage, but it's just as effective. So things like that are so tricky, but that doesn't mean the damage stat is useless. It just means you need to look at it. You get some idea like, oh, does it seem high or low? And if it seems to really stand out in one direction, then you can either kind of take that and say, it seems kind of high, that's nice. Or you can then go look at their champion pool. You can look at, what they played against. You can look at other stuff about, their game lengths and so on. It depends how deep down the rabbit hole you want to go.
I was going to say, this is an onion with many layers that you're peeling.
And damage is a tough example because damage is one of the trickiest ones. But, that said, I would say that things like KDA ratio are not as bad as it might seem on the surface. Doesn't mean that a player with a higher KDA is worse, or that that with a higher KDA is better, or that one with lower is worse. But usually if you do kind of sort players by that and then have your own kind of power ranking of those players, it's usually not that far off. Then you then have to kind of figure out where the differences are in those rankings and where they might come from. So that one, it's not completely useless. Kill participation is one that people bring up a lot. That is very much to do with team play style and the player's style. So that's one that I would not use as how good they are, but as you could argue that it's how important they are to their team and how central they are to their team's action. It also depends just on, does the team do a lot of 5v5 team fighting? Do they do a lot of skirmishing, stuff like that?
So when you listen to content for League and you hear people saying, oh, he's got the highest KP in the league or highest KDA, do you just sit in your chair and cringe because it only tells a portion of the story, or like? Not
necessarily. I think it always depends on the sentences that come afterwards. Yeah. If they say something like, hey, here's a jungler and he's got an 85% kill participation, and that means he's really good, and then they just stop there, that can cringe a little bit. But if they keep going with that and say, and it's because he's starting all the team fights, it's because the team doesn't get anything accomplished unless he's there, then I go, yeah, that's a good point. So it's always about what are the few sentences that the number is being placed in the middle of, and if those sentences all make sense together, then it's a good number that actually makes sense. But I don't think it's that different from statistics in most disciplines. It's just a matter of, are you making the effort to understand it and know where it comes from?
Yeah,
and then it can be useful.
So we've got KDA, we've got KP. I think those are two pretty safe ones for us to go with.
Yeah, I'd say for carries, damage can be useful, but it's very directional. It's not. Yeah. It's if it's high, that's probably better. If it's low, that's probably worse. But you got to look a lot deeper into it. Beyond those ones, I tend to get everything starts to get segmented in different parts of the game. So you can look at laning stats, you can look at CS differences or gold or experience differences at 10 or 15 minutes. I find those very interesting. Again, they're very contextual based on things like lane matchups, which champions you're playing as and against, or say you're a mid laner and you have a low CS difference, it might have to do with your jungler.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't always blame the jungler for everything, but it can be part of it. But I do find those ones very interesting, especially when you have a larger number of games being counted, because it starts to kind of normalize some of those other factors like champion pools.
Well, and this is kind of a tease a little bit at what we're going to start talking more about when we get into last season with the team. But I mean, I don't think you can underestimate the impact of the other 4 players on your team on your stats, right? So if you're 1v9ing, your stats are going to look way worse on average. And it's going to really, it's going to skew the overall sense. So, I mean, that feels very obvious, but it kind of, in some ways it might hide the true potential of a player. And I guess what I'm getting at here is it makes you wonder how good somebody like Ssumday could be if he had a really solid supporting cast across the map.
Yeah, no, I mean it's one of the interesting little challenges of, can you use, statistics to help identify players who are, better than their team make them seem. Or potentially vice versa, a player who is just kind of an average player on a really great team, and it makes it look like they're really good. That is something you can do in certain cases. I think, again, if you don't have kind of the eye test to support it, it's going to be difficult to kind of dig that out, because the numbers that point that way, which might be, really high kill participations in a case like, a player who's really struggling to carry a bad team, that could come from multiple sources. And maybe it comes from the source of, hey, they're really great, but, they're not getting any help. It could come from other things.
Right.
But yeah.
Two things pop to mind for me. One is we had a game where Ssumday went 0-0-0 and lost, obviously. And then we had a game where Riccara went like 9-0-13 or something. I think that was a Worlds game. And we all know that Riccara is not consistently putting in that kind of work. So it just illustrates the point you made there. Yeah. Well, cool. Let's start talking a little bit about just looking forward to next season in general here. Been some pretty big changes in the preseason patches that are coming out. Just kind of at a high level and in brief, what would you say these changes, like if there's going to be a big change, like thinking back to last season, it was basically just the Fiesta meta. And I don't know if anyone would have called that necessarily, but are there a couple of things that you're keeping an eye out for as players who are more likely to shine in this meta, or things that we should all be kind of prepared for?
Yeah. So I think my own perspective on this is usually a little bit tough, because I'm not, a high elo player who's picking up these things from my own personal experience. I'm based more on watching other people and talking to people and kind of picking up stuff from that. So, there's not a lot of League to watch right now, really nothing. I guess the cup starts soon, I think. So that should be kind of fun. And that's where you start to get a feel for some of these things. But I think, I don't see anything that's going to be really fundamentally different. I think there were some rumors that there might be some kind of duo mid stuff, or kind of jungle funneling trying to come back up. But Riot's already been pushing back against that, trying to make sure it doesn't hit by the time the season starts. I've heard some rumblings about things like a lot of solo lane swapping, but that's that's a draft problem. It's not really a gameplay. That doesn't seem like something that's going to have a huge effect on the actual gameplay. It's more just makes the draft puzzle that much more difficult, because a lot of flex pick basically. The turret plating is the one that, on the surface at least, seems like it has the potential to shift a lot of things. I find it a really fascinating problem, because the idea obviously is to slow down the pace of the early game, kind of extend the laning phase, give people more chance to kind of sit in their lanes and try to get farm advantages or even kill each other. But where I see it getting really interesting is one of the most common basic plays of the early game for a long time has been, or at least since they brought in kind of the difference in tower shields, or armor rather, in the early game, and made the bottom lane one weaker, is you kind of set up a window where your mid lane can leave the lane and come towards the bottom lane. The jungle goes with them. You all dive the bottom tower together, or at least force them off. You take the first tower bottom, and then that opens up a whole bunch of things for you. You get to go back and maybe take the dragon if you have time for it, or you just all recall and you go in top lane and you take that one instead, and you've got this big, it snowballs into a whole bunch of things. With the turret plating, that is still a viable play. In fact, some people that I speak to think it's even a more important play, because it's so much harder to take that tower without having 4 or even 5 people on it.
Yeah. Right.
But because it's going to take longer to do it, even with that number of people, I'm really interested to see, does that slow down the ability to actually execute the snowball that comes afterwards? Because the other team has more time to react and stop you from then going to the top lane, going to the dragon, going to all these other things. So I think that specific play became so common. We saw it almost every game, at least, attempting to do it. And either it worked or it didn't, but is that still something that people are going to try to execute? Or is it something that they're just going to say, no, you know what, it's okay, we're actually going to do it right intended here. We're going to sit in our lanes. We're going to farm. We're going to have some standard jungle ganks. That's the one that, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference to most viewers, but at the actual kind of pro strategy level, the way you solve that little puzzle of, is that still the optimal play? or do we do something else? I think that's the one that I'm really keeping my eye on.
Yeah, we are as well, because we know that who he likes to roam, and this gives him maybe a little bit more flexibility to do that. So, especially if you get him on Aurelion Soul, which I'm just hoping that doesn't get banned every time. But,
which has a buff coming up, right? Did I hear that?
Yeah. I've heard.
All right,
it's
so
like,
we're ready for the season of Huhi.
They might as well call it the Huhi buff, right? Like, who else is really benefiting from that? All 1,000 people who played him last season. Well, cool. So we're kind of getting into maybe now territory of specific players. So let's look back at last season a little bit. And one that Cole and I are always talking about, and I feel like we're always kind of doing an ad campaign for, is Anda. And so we would love it if you could just weigh in on Anda a little bit, whether it's your own, perspective on him as a player. And by the way, let me just pause here and say, if there are certain players or teams or strats that you can't talk about because of other work you're doing, just say, I'll take a pass on that one. But I'm hoping that at least you can say, from a fan's perspective, here's how I'd look at it.
Yeah. No worries.
So anyway, back to the question. Cole and I are high on Anda. We think he's worth a lot, and we think he's great. Where do you fall on that? And are there stats to either back that up, or is it just fan perspective from your sense?
Yeah, I think kind of putting the whole Anda thing, in context, because they brought him in. Obviously, they made that change to bring him in, and I think from my perspective, and I wasn't watching them really closely, like, to have a really educated and informed opinion on this, I'd want to go back and probably study half a dozen VODs of how he played and how they played before before and after they had him, but nothing really stood out to me as something really exceptional, which isn't to say he's a bad player. I think across the board, pretty much in almost every statistical category, he's right around the middle, which is a fine place to be. That's not a problem at all. But I didn't see a lot of ways that he either brought them up or brought them down. He played a pretty mixed champion pool, mostly tanks. Seemed like he had a little more success on the tanks. He had he died a little bit more often than Meteos did, but he contributed a little more damage. I think I didn't see a lot to really argue either direction on him, but the reason that I think it was a good move for 100 Thieves to bring him in, and that I think it will continue to be the right call for them, not knowing what other options they might have had this offseason, for example, is that he is a younger player than Meteos, for example. There's a lot more opportunity to kind of shape his mindset and shape his play style and have him fit in with what they need than there would have been with a much more veteran player who has their own existing style and wants to be the one kind of shaping others to meet them. So I think Anda is the right person, again, not knowing him that well, like personally or anything, to know how well he actually fits with that, being coachable and being moldable, that kind of thing. But it makes sense to me kind of on paper. And I do think he has more potential than he's shown bits of it. And I think he has more that he can show.
So is it accurate then to summarize that as, like, you view him as kind of an average level NA jungler, with, some room to grow, but he might have still been a net positive for the team based off of, chemistry factors?
Yeah, more or less, I'd say.
Okay. That's a more dialed back, reasonable perspective than perhaps we, because we're like Jordan said, we're very high on him. I feel like he's just ramped up as we've gone on. He was one of our more consistent players at Worlds, I felt like. So,
and I think that is a really interesting way to put it, Cole. He's just been really consistent for us. And Tim, I think that actually fits really well with what you've said. It's kind of like he's one of those guys who he's never lost us a game, right? Like, all right, maybe with the odd exception, but he just generally plays well. He may not be the guy who's going to turn it all around and bring it back, although he's had some really outstanding, like, Baron steals and things like that, of course. So it was, I think the thing that's exciting about him is we saw that consistency transfer from NALCS to Worlds, which gives me a lot of hope that, as he improves, as his upside is met, that level, the consistent level that he delivers, just very steady, is just going to go up.
Yeah. And another North American jungler who gets that type of description fairly often is Xmithy. And people love Xmithy. If you can have the kind of career Xmithy's had, over that kind of period of time, nobody's going to be disappointed with that at all.
Not a bad career.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to put that down as slightly above average. Is that fair?
Yeah.
We'll sell him up as high as we can.
I sold him up all the way to slightly above average.
Let me watch him a little more closely next season.
Yeah.
I'll update it then.
We'll keep an eye out for your updated Anda takes throughout this next season. And I should also probably note that I think my Anda takes are way on the optimistic side, as many of my takes are. So no pressure to join me on that one, because I think most people would pass. All right, so we talked about excuse me, Anda and Meteos, and it sounds like you do think that was a good trade. Statistically speaking, though, I did want to just check and see if you have. I think you mentioned that Anda's numbers are similar or slightly above Meteos's during the games that they both played for 100 Thieves.
Yeah, right? I didn't do too much of a direct kind of comparison between the two. Like I said, I noticed a little bit more damage coming out of Anda, but it's a little bit hard to say how much of that is champion pool related and like meta related, split to split. A little bit higher death share for Anda, but again, I think 100 Thieves, if I remember correctly, in summer split, they've always been kind of a little bit slower, more reserved team, not fighting as often. But I think they did fight a little bit more in summer split, which leads to just more opportunity for variance and kind of how often each member dies, things like that. So
yeah, summer split got kind of dicey there for a while. Just kind of flailing, maybe is the word to put it. All right, so jungle's good. Let's move on to everyone's favorite Ssumday. And I think with Ssumday, I'm sure you've got a lot of interesting thoughts on him. But one of the things that people have really kind of, this is, I guess, a point of contention, was everybody was just scratching their head on why didn't we put him on carry champions, especially when it got time to go to Worlds. He had maybe one game on a carry, and it just didn't go that well. But one of the things we're interested to get your perspective on is, obviously there's a risk to playing a carry champion, right? They either come online or they don't. So we've thought about why he didn't get more time on carry champions. So any thoughts you have on whether that's, when you have a really high skill player like Ssumday with a champion pool that touches on a lot of carries, is it better to just put them on a carry, or what are some of the reasons that teams might decide it's just not worth it in that case?
I'd say, when it comes to top lane specifically, which is obviously kind of the role that has the biggest variance in being able to go all the way full carry, all the way back to full tank. The only other role that has anywhere similar is jungle, and it's just not the same resource level. It's a really interesting conversation. Depends on a lot of inputs, which include, is the player, able to play both styles well. But really it comes down more in the top lane to, is the team able to play both styles well? Can your team play carry top laners? Can your team play tank top laners? Some pretty simple numbers, some pretty simple math on Ssumday on carries in 2018 summer. He was 2-1 on Fiora. Hey, that's not bad. He was 2-1 on Camille, 1-0 on Echo, but he was 0-7 on a combination of Renekton, Jace, Gangplank, Swain, Kled. Renekton arguably more bruiser than carry, but wow. I think that math lines up kind of going into Worlds fairly clearly. Like it's definitely not Ssumday's issue, in my opinion. Ssumday is capable of playing all those champions. He played it in Korea before he came over to North America. One of the things that made him one of the best top laners in the world is he can play both styles so well. And, his team was always able to work around him. He can engage, incredibly well on tanks. He can do all the kind of peeling and self-sacrificial play, but he could also carry when the moment came. But I think really the question for 100 Thieves last year, and a question that they're going to have to re-ask and re-answer this year is, how do they function when he's on a carry? You need a lot of help from your jungler and your mid laner, and not just in the sense of them coming to your lane and helping you out, but if your mid laner isn't able to push his lane forward and kind of get those opportunities to step out into the side, into the river and clear some vision or place his own vision, threaten the roam, have all these opportunities to kind of make the enemy team react to you in those kind of 5 to 10 second windows, it becomes way harder to be the top laner who is, usually when you're a carry, you're the one who's trying to apply that pressure as well. If your mid laner can't do that, that really exposes you. And then your jungler has multiple places he needs to be paying attention. Is he able to push forward or not? these are things that I think 100 Thieves didn't really have the assets to do for Ssumday as well last year. I think obviously they're hoping that with the changes to their lineup, that will change a little bit. I think also when you look at the bottom lane, how reliably can your bottom lane play a low resource role when the top laner's getting, the junglers help, when the top laner's getting the mid laners resources to help them, and now can your bottom lane just kind of sit back and come under fire without throwing away too much. Obviously they've made a bit of a change there that possibly that opens up,
we'll say.
Yeah, possibly that opens up some some differences in how they kind of balance those resources across the map. So I think 100 Thieves last year really needed Ssumday to be the person giving help rather than receiving help, which is why they succeeded so much more with him on tanks, which he's just excellent at playing. But the rest of the team wasn't really that effective when they were the ones, having to be the ones helping him.
I'm so glad you made that point so well, because I think what happened, Reddit is Reddit, right? We know Reddit is Reddit. You get Reddit takes and they're quick and they're usually lacking substance, lacking logic maybe.
I object.
I think what we saw is that there was really a lot of buzz around Ssumday for MVP when he was on that string of Darius games, and he was really popping off on a couple of carries, for maybe 4 or 5 games in a row. And when that stopped happening and we started losing a little bit, maybe due to other factors, people just automatically connected those two things. But how many, I can't recall ever seeing that stat of him 0-7 on those champions anywhere. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so that's super interesting. Something that, I had never seen brought up before. So thank you for making that point.
Yeah. I think a little bit of that is just, it's like it's more game knowledge. It's equal parts game knowledge and stats, right? But it is good to hear that you can't just put somebody. It's not as easy as just putting somebody on a carry champion and having them play well, right? There's a lot more to it than that.
No.
And I think Ssumday got a lot of heat unnecessarily, and probably people were like, "What's wrong with Probably? Why don't I just put Ssumday on a carry?"
Yeah. Well, and it's also a matter of not appreciating a good tank player. I think a lot of the time, because the things a tank player does well are not easy to see unless you know what you're looking for and are actively looking for them. There are players out there who this is their entire specialty, and some of them get celebrated because, for example, the casters call them out a lot. So Soaz, for example, this is one of the things he's so good at, is playing a champion who gets no help. He gets pushed under his tower, he gets dove, and somehow he gets away. He doesn't give up the death, he doesn't give up the tower. A player in North America who I think has been criminally underrated because of this skill set is Impact. He's been ranked down in the bottom half of LCS top laners at times by people whose opinions I really respect, and it's because I think it's because they see this skill set so differently than mine, and they look for this certain other skill set that maybe he doesn't have as much of, or the team doesn't call for as much of. And they just, it's a different value in this ability to help the team in ways that are sometimes direct, sometimes indirect. Ssumday is so good at all of those things.
Yeah. It's worth mentioning. I think the Impact is maybe the only player that's consistently given Ssumday some problems. You know what I mean? He has stalled out Ssumday in every game they've played. So
he's the foil.
Yeah, he is.
Okay, cool. Well, I feel better personally just having that out there. So thank you, Tim. That's good for me. We talked a little bit about and this is more kind of our wrapping up 2018. We'll get into the 2019 stuff here pretty shortly. Sure. But you'd made a comment about 100 Thieves last year being a pretty slow starting team or a slower playing team. Part of it is it's just the perception, right? And Doublelift has called us a boring team. I don't know, I'm sure you could find the thing that it is exactly that makes it that way to people. But do you see that? Does that play out in the numbers? Are we just a slower team? I guess I don't know what number exactly would show that, but
yeah, it depends a little bit which version of slow you're talking about. One is, how often the team fights, slow paced in that sense. The other is, you could argue that it describes kind of weak in the early game and then comes online later. Kind of slow at the start of the game, but then really powers up. I'd say in some senses the kind of slower paced one did apply. Usually 100 Thieves were in the lower area of the league in how many kills per minute, across both teams, combined kills per minute were happening. It did pick up a lot in the summer, and they seem to fight more often. But I think when I hear people describe 100 Thieves that way, I think it's more often talking about, are they able to kind of push a lead in the early game and then snowball it? Like, are they that kind of aggressive, we're gonna smash your face in kind of team? And I think that description is a little unfair, at least if you look at it statistically. They were not a bad early game team by any means. If you look at their spring regular season, I've got a model called the early game rating that looks at their as of the 15-minute mark, what is their percent chance to win based on kind of the state of the game. They were at about a 54% chance to win at 15 minutes spring split. That's slightly above average. 51% in spring, right around average. That's not a poor early game team. That's an average early game team. That's not bad. And especially when you're then going ahead and you're actually executing in the mid and late game, which they generally were.
Yeah.
I think, there's a war of philosophies of, what is the best way to play a league. And there's a huge group, I'd say the majority, who say you want to be in control, you want to be setting the pace, you want to be getting ahead and staying ahead and closing. And that's the ideal way to play League of Legends. But I think just because that's the majority opinion doesn't mean that it's right for every team. Doesn't mean that it's the opinion of every coach or every player. And I think 100 Thieves are a team that took not the opposite philosophy, but kind of reeled that back in at least a little bit and said, you know what, we don't have to be out there smashing everyone early. As long as we don't let them smash us, we know that we can close it out later. Yeah. And I think there's nothing wrong with that at all. I think self-awareness is more important than kind of the ideal approach. I think they had that.
I would be really interested to hear, and I'm not asking you to pull this stat up right now, but it feels like we overcame a lot of goal deficits. And I've got to imagine that we had to be up there, right, of the different teams who, it wasn't all that uncommon to see us down 2, 3, 4K gold. There was every once in a while there'd be like the 9 or 10K gold game that somehow we'd come back and win. But I think when I think about it, I imagine that's what a lot of people are talking about, and it's got to feel frustrating to play against us because you feel like you should have a lead, but why are we still losing towers? Why are we being chipped away at? Why can't we take objectives? That kind of thing. Sure. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the one number that I could give that kind of supports that is kind of the counterpart to the early game rating, which is, relative to your probability, how likely you should be to win. How many did you actually win? And in that set, they were +9. So they won 9 percentage points more games than they would have been expected to, which is second best in the league in summer split regular season. So, cool. That's not bad. That doesn't necessarily say they were making comebacks. That might have been, they're closing all the games they should have been closing and, losing the ones they should have. But that it does imply, there were some comebacks that came in and they closed the ones they should be. And, that's not bad.
Go team.
Just a tangential question on that, because obviously we don't have a whole lot of games to give you a good sample size for this. So, I mean, how do you feel that, like, how accurate a representation are you getting on numbers like that, where you're like, I can say this with confidence, or I can say this and think it's good, what sort of level of confidence do you have with that?
Yeah, it's more on the second side. Like if I see these numbers, I'd say I generally don't see numbers like these with like kind of the early game rating, mid-late rating, and have them really go like, whoa, that seems way off. This is what's kind of allowed me to kind of keep confidence in that type of modeling. They're relatively simple models from, a data science perspective. But I think that's an advantage because it allows you to you have to recognize with this, when you're modeling such a complex game as League, there's always going to be factors you can't measure. There's going to be things you have to interpret, things you have to apply subjectivity to. And sometimes just embracing that is better than trying to layer in more and more variables, trying to remove more and more of that, and starting to convince yourself, oh, most of the subjectivity is gone now. And I think that's very dangerous. So simpler models like these ones that give you like, oh, a +9, second best in league, that's pretty good. Maybe it should actually be a +6. Maybe they should be third instead of second. I don't know. But you know what? As long as you get a feeling of, is it a little high, medium high, very low, I think those things are useful. And I think in this case, it tells more or less the correct story based on, what I've actually watched.
Yeah. Okay.
Like your number one in that model is not Golden Guardians, is what you're saying.
Right.
Okay, so it's past that test at least. That's good.
2019, we'll see.
2019 is a different ballgame, and I actually on a recent pod I mentioned Golden Guardians as being a potential team to be near the bottom, and then they went and flipped the script on me. So
Yeah, we'll
I
see.
guess I'll have to stop using them as an example, or I guess we'll see. Well, cool. Let's look ahead a little bit with that comment, Golden Guardians. Interested for your take. We've talked a little bit about Anda, so I'm guessing that you'd say he's about 5th or 4th position rank, and you don't have to do like a hard position rank, but if you want to do more directional, what would you? Yeah, if you want to just kind of take us through each of the starters we got for 2019 and let us know how you're looking at them.
Sure. So, if we just kind of go through it in positional order, I'd say, other than having already spoken about Andan, I'd say he's somewhere in the middle of the pack. Ssumday, if he's not top 2, then I haven't thought through it hard enough. He's easily a top 2, arguably top 1, but it depends kind of how you value certain skill sets over others. Who he, I think he's got certain skill sets that are really interesting. I think reuniting him with Aframu could be beneficial. I'm not super high on him overall as a player, but I think he has the opportunity now to kind of come back and reclaim some of what made people excited about him in the first place. So right now I'd say going into the season, I'd put him a little bit below kind of the middle of the pack, but I wouldn't be surprised if kind of, like the Aframu partnership and all of that does give him some kind of revitalization. Bang, definitely top 2. Aframu, is a very interesting one. I think he's highly debatable where his value is, partly because his value compared to a few years ago is becoming more and more intangible. I think it's moving much more into leadership, macro. People always called him, a big shot calling guy, but that used to be, from my perspective, that used to be more because he was out there kind of making the plays happen more often, in a very visible way with his own body, if you want to put it that way. And now it seems like, especially with the team's play style, it's a lot more like the team is doing this thing over here, and it's because Aframu 3 minutes ago described this plan.
Right.
You can't really go in and just watch the game and see it happen. You'd have to be listening to the communications and see all their preparation and stuff. So I think that Aframu's value is very hard to rate. I think you could argue him anywhere from 2 to 6, honestly, as an individual player. So, but his value is so behind the scenes.
I definitely feel like he was consensus number 1 spring split last year, picked up the MVP. The summer split, it felt like time and time again, we just saw him going in, right, throwing everything he had at it, like going into the middle of the whole team, engaging, and then nothing behind it. And from a statistical perspective, that looks pretty bad. That looks like a lot of deaths, and I think he was pretty high on deaths so far as the overall league ranking goes on that one. So, I definitely take what you're saying there on tough to consider Afro's last split, based on who we know he is as a player.
Can we talk about something that Tim said? He said Bang is top 2. Now, I'm going to make an assumption. This assumption is based on the Team Liquid jersey that's hanging on the wall behind you. I'm going to guess that you're talking about Doublelift as the other one in that top 2. Is there anything you can elaborate on there? Like how do you really think they match up? Obviously, we've talked about on this show how we consider it a rivalry with Liquid, whether or not they do, because we haven't really beat them, and you have to beat people for it to be a rivalry. But that said, we're hoping that with Bang in there, we can just punch Doublelift in the mouth a few times. So do you mind comparing those two players a little bit?
Sure. Or? Yeah, I mean, I think you could do a whole podcast or even a series of podcasts on or other series.
The Doublelift pod, the Doublelift Bang.
Yeah. And I'll also throw out, just for context, I was a Curse fan before they became Team Liquid.
Oh, okay. All right.
I came by this one honestly.
Okay.
I think the comparison between them is much less about, who is overall the better player and who has kind of which skill sets, which mindsets, and kind of where that's coming from. To me, I see Doublelift more as kind of the brash, aggressive, we're going to take over the game kind of player. He's in some ways he's mellowed out a little bit and become a little bit less of that and a little bit more of kind of the team player. Like he doesn't have to be the one drawing the resources and kind of crushing the lane. He's not the Piglet anymore who, that's really Piglet's gear, and Doublelift used to be a little bit more like that. Bang to me has he has some of that element to him, but he's struck me more as, the let's do better than average in the early game and then absolutely crush the team fights, and always show up, always do the mid and late game work that needs to be done, be versatile. So I'd say from my very simplified perspective of it, Doublelift is a little bit more of the early game AD carry. Bang is a little bit more of the mid and late game AD carry, and calling a difference between them in kind of individual skill overall is very difficult.
Yeah. I think we'll need to also see how Bang works in NA. That's gonna be a thing too. Like that could make a huge difference, or it can just be negligible. We honestly have no idea how that's gonna work out, and he's not over here yet playing with him.
Right.
So we have to obviously wait, and on our side we'll be crossing our fingers.
I'm sure everybody on both sides will be crossing them. Just a question of who you're rooting for. One other duo that I wanted to ask about was you said Ssumday is by definition top 2, probably top 1. The one that comes to mind for me is Licorice, and especially after his Worlds performances. Just interested. I don't know if that's who you would put in the number 2 spot or 1 spot, but how do you see that matchup going from a playstyle or stats breakdown perspective?
Yeah, top lane is one that I haven't honestly thought through as deeply. I think there are so many good top laners in NA right now. Licorice can be argued up there. I think Huni is a very enigmatic player, but I think from a pure skill perspective, you can't argue him out of that range. Value to the team, well, it depends on the team. Mm-hmm. Are they a Huni team or are they a non-Huni team? That completely defines it. And top lane is such a rich role. It's so multi-dimensional because you can do so many different kinds of things for the team. I really find it difficult to kind of pitch certain players over each other in that regard.
Just because it depends so much on what you're asking them to do.
Yeah, and some of the value for Licorice, like not to take anything away from him at all, but as a domestic player, that raises his profile that much more, and deservedly so. Relative to someone like Ssumday, who's filling up this import slot and adding every bit of value he can to that. But when you have someone like Licorice as a roster building block is, I would say, more valuable than Ssumday because he's this domestic player. Mm-hmm. But as a pure, which player is just better, leave all those other factors aside, I would probably still argue for Ssumday. But they've been playing on different teams in different circumstances, and it's for top laners specifically, I think it's very difficult to judge that.
We will have to see. 2019 will tell.
Well, speaking of 2019, something that I was interested to bring up in this conversation is, obviously we're going to have a significant shift in the amount of talent that's on the team. What kind of differences do you think we'll see from the 2018 team in terms of play style, and what kind of strategies, if you were coaching, what sort of things would you do to take advantage of the assets we have now?
I don't think 100 Thieves will have to make kind of philosophical changes to how they play. I think what they've done is equip themselves with a roster that can play more of the style that they've already been playing and just play it more effectively, which is a great thing to have done. So basically, I've kind of described it a little bit, but make sure that the early game goes pretty even. If you can get a little bit ahead, that's great, but really what you're playing for is survive any creativity or aggression they bring your way, and then take control in the macro in the mid and late game and win the team fights. Like, I think that's a style that is going to serve them very well. I think there's some potential, and there's going to be some opportunity for Afro and Huhi to do some of these crazy roaming plays and get really aggressive, but I think that's going to be the exception rather than the rule. I think they're going to try to tame it down. They're going to focus on getting Bang through the early game, protecting him in the draft, protecting Huhi in the draft, because honestly, Huhi is not the strongest laner. his strengths are come in other areas. So they have to make sure that he's not getting exploited in the lane. They have to make sure that people aren't just all inning on shutting down Bang. And as long as they get through that with, even if you're riding Ssumday on tanks every game and you're asking Bang to do almost all the damage, well, they're going to be able to, as long as they aren't coming from these huge deficits. And so I think, owning the river, kind of neutralizing that kind of stuff, placing a lot of vision and being conservative, making mid lane a 2v2. These are some kind of things that they're probably going to employ a lot of, and that they to some extent already were. And I think it's the right way to do it for their team.
Speaking of Huhi, do you view Huhi in for Ryu as like a net positive for the team, or where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I'd say in my perspective, it's not a huge net positive. I'd say, it is a step in the right direction, depending on how much who he's able to kind of reclaim from rejoining Afro. I think Ryu, it seemed like he was kind of losing some of that. It seemed like he was kind of slowing down over time. That was just the perspective I had on it. I don't know if that was, it's hard to say what that was based on, but it felt like he was, it's not that he wasn't trying, but there was just a little less and less he could give over time. And I think Huhi is not at that stage. I think he still has the chance to kind of swing it back up and offer more than he's currently offering. And, if he can bring in some communication and some creativity that they weren't getting otherwise, I think there's very little risk there. And given how hard it can be to pick up a really good mid laner, I definitely don't see it as a bad move.
Yeah. Another domestic mid laner, to your point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
I thought it was interesting. This is kind of, this is obviously anecdotal, but one of the things that we did on the show together was we went through and did a top 15 plays of the year. And I was surprised at how much Ryu showed up in that in terms of creativity. Like, he seemed like he had, several plays that just blew us away in terms of his creativity. So I think we're going to see a different type of that from Huhi.
Yeah.
But yeah, we were Ryu fans. We thought he was maybe trashed a little bit too much, and so it's good to hear the thought that Huhi could be a net positive there.
And it's like I said, it's very difficult for me to say kind of where that opinion came from or where that perception came from. That I, the last year or even a little over a year, that it was difficult for me to have a lot of exciting things to say about Ryu. And it wasn't that he was holding back anything like that, but I just felt like he didn't have that much more to give.
Well, and he definitely was. He had a really hard Worlds run, and let's make sure we remind everyone that he was up against Caps and Rookie. So the number 1 and 2 mid laners in the world, arguably. But what we learned from that was, you wouldn't say he's even close to third, right? Like, he was way far behind, and definitely got kind of exposed in mid lane. So if this is a team with Worlds aspirations, then they've got to make moves. And to your point, I think this is at least a step in the right direction.
Yeah. And let's also bear in mind that, what is happening with the rest of the team affects a lot what the single player can do. And, the mid laners can be affected a lot by how much threat the enemy team sees coming from the bottom lane or the top lane. And if the team is only really succeeding when Ssumday's on tanks, and then meantime, there was some turmoil with the bottom lane and who's playing and do they have they developed synergy yet, all that kind of stuff, that affects someone like Ryu as well. So
yep.
You can't lay it all on his feet, even if there was anything like that. And
right,
I don't consider myself the most trustworthy judge of mid laner, pure skill. So
yeah,
take it all with a grain of salt from my perspective.
Well, we trust you more than we trust us.
More than we trust ourselves.
Yeah. So let's zoom out a little bit and maybe start looking towards just some other general questions. One of the things that was really interesting to me. So this was a Worlds that was likely the best that the West has ever seen. Do you have an opinion on what worked there for the West specifically? Is it possible to repeat that? What the Worlds meta that we've came to means for the rest of the league and for our region? Just some thoughts on Worlds from you.
Yeah, I think there's been some discussion out there of people looking for kind of concrete factors to explain this. And they, one of the ones that I've seen most is, Riot nerfed the Vision game. They took away, Tracker's Knife, and that you can't place as many wards. And Korea always won because they had the most wards and they knew how to predict everything you're going to do and stuff. Maybe there's some truth to that. I don't buy it that much personally. To me, it's really about the soft factors. I believe that this was the year that some of the Western teams finally actually believed that Korea was vulnerable, and then it came out in the results. I think we saw in past years people would get close. At MSI, I believe it was Fnatic took SKT to 5 games. Misfits take, again, was it SKT or someone to 5 games a year ago? I don't remember the details, but people got close, but they never quite broke through. And even back to several years ago, people would come really close, they'd fall short against Korea, and there would be this sense of, well, they're unbeatable. Sure, we can come close, but we'll never beat them. These guys are too good. It's impossible. And even if that was not what you said out loud, there were a lot of signs that that's what people actually internalized. And that just creates this huge mental block. And I've always felt, and I've always been one of the people beating this drum of the gap is closing for probably 3.5 years. Yeah. And people would, not very many people would agree with me, or they just think
right. It was a meme, right?
The Western hype guy, right? And I always just felt it's because it's a mindset. And finally, things started to break down. I think there are some outside factors as well. Can't say it's purely a mental thing, because that in some ways that does make it feel a little bit cheap, and I understand why people don't want to feel that way about it. But Korea can't keep bleeding talent forever without feeling any effects of it. They've been losing more and more players every year. Things did change with the vision game. Things did change with certain play styles. But ultimately, I think the main factor was this kind of mental ability to actually believe like these guys are just another League of Legends team. There's nothing that makes them inherently better than us. We can just go out and do it. And the way that I think that actually manifested was being able to play your own style, being able to play at a higher pace, not this kind of stereotypically Korean, like play very conservatively, only take the 90-10 plays. Go and do something that these are the ways that people almost beat Korea in the past, but maybe it'll work next time. And so they kept doing it, and this time it actually did work. In some ways, the meta helped with that as well. But
with the mental piece being such a key factor, are there things that you look for to find players who are strong mentally or who bring a good mental to the game, or is it just completely observational?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm not sure I'm the right person for that question, honestly. It's I tend to sit back here kind of in the ivory tower and look down and these people.
Like I guess what I'm asking is, when you look at the numbers, is there something that jumps out as like, this guy's he's mentally strong, or you can tell?
I really think this is something you can't measure from in-game performance that well, unless you're able to measure things like aggressive engages, like, oh, this guy just took a 50-50 play. You can't really mark that in the numbers, right?
Yeah, but
you can notice it when they're on the Rift,
right?
Specifically when they're playing against those opponents that they've kind of been blocked against. So yeah,
so we can't scout the perfect mental foil to Korea yet. Maybe not yet, but we'll get there. We'll get there. Yeah. I think I'm it, actually. Untiltable. Well, I know we're right about at an hour, so maybe we'll close on this note.
Well, I was going to ask, actually, we had a couple viewer questions. Tim, do you have about 5 more minutes if you mind?
Yeah, let's end on those. Cool, let's do that.
Sorry, yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Jordan. I just
I'm glad you did.
Give a few of these a crack. So one of the questions, I'm going to modify this one coming from the YouTube chat from Sam St. John. So I'm just gonna tweak it a little bit. So, do you think that the current roster for 100 Thieves is good enough to get out of group stages at Worlds? And if not, what sort of change would be made?
I mean, getting out of group stage at Worlds, it depends a lot on the draw. Mm-hmm. And where you fall in the draw depends a lot on kind of what seed you got. So, let's start the question off with, are they good enough to win a first seed from North America? I'd say, yeah, they're good enough. Are they the favorites? I mean, it depends who you ask. I'd say they're probably number 2 favorites right now, which means obviously within striking distance of getting out number 1. Whether you come in as a number 1 or a number 2 seed, well, how did NA do at MSI? Did they get a first pool kind of drawing or not? But
right.
I think they could get out of groups. They'd probably need a little bit of luck in the draw, but I don't see anything that is a really fundamental flaw about their team that would hold them back. Their future is probably going to be mostly determined by themselves.
Yeah,
and a little bit of luck,
of course,
and not drawing SKT. So, and you kind of alluded to this, like, that maybe they're typically considered the number 2 team. And from what I listened to a lot of analysis and other podcasts and stuff, and I would agree with, that consensus, with Team Liquid being the favorite. How wide do you think that margin is? Do you think it's like a really close thing like we do because we're fanboys, or do you think like Team Liquid is demonstrably better?
I don't think it's a massive gap between Team Liquid and 100 Thieves. I think both teams are going to have to prove synergy. I'd say, if you're going to put this as simple, like put the 5, head to head against each other, the rosters for each team, you'd probably give 100 Thieves the advantage in the top lane. You'd give Team Liquid an advantage in the mid lane. But the rest is all going to fall out pretty evenly. And it's going to come down to, who actually brings the best strategies and communication into the game and executes them from there. So coaching is going to play a huge role too. I don't see anything between them that really says, one team is going to dominate the other. But once you fall off from that number 2 spot, I think it starts to feel like a bigger gap between kind of 2 and then the rest of the pack. But those 2, I think, are not a huge separation.
Yeah. Okay. And then just one last question. This one from Twitch chat. Wild Shot asks, how hard do you think it's going to be to play side lanes in an early and mid game in a meta that prioritizes top half early game snowballing?
Yeah, well, I think that kind of priority in the meta shifts a lot even within a patch, let alone across patches, and we're pretty far out from what the actual kind of start of year patch is going to look like. I've always been of the mindset that you should focus more on playing to what your team does well rather than on what the meta says you should be doing as kind of the optimal way to play, because if you execute on a perfect 100, then of course doing the best strategy is the best. But if you can execute the best possible strategy at a 60% level or the third best possible strategy at a 95% level, you can do the math on it depending on how that falls out. But I wouldn't personally, if I'm the team, get too hung up in some of those kind of details. I think it's playing to the side lanes is tougher if your mid lane can't get pressure and get, windows to roam and to apply that pressure elsewhere on the map. I think that's 100 Thieves should be looking more internally to how can we make sure that our mid lane can get pressure, because this is probably the most obvious kind of weak point in their lineup on paper. Less about the meta and more about here's our roster. How do we address this? Because other teams are going to look at this and say, hey, we can exploit him in lane. Let's draft, mid lane counter picks. Let's have someone like Jensen come in and just kind of smash him and open up a 20 CS lead. Like, that's what they're going to try to do. And so regardless of the meta, that's what 100 Thieves need to be thinking about.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
So Cole, do you want to, if there are no other questions, do you want to kind of wrap us up?
Yeah, well, let me just say, Tim, thank you so much for coming on with us. Like, we try to be extremely transparent about the fact that Jordan and I are like not analysts, right? Like, we're a couple of like silver players and we're garbage or whatever. So having you here is just like really cool to get us a more just a smarter look at the team. We're obviously super excited about 2019 because we feel like, we are right in there to fight. And some of the things that you said, some of the points you've made, I feel like give me hope for better performance this season. So again, thank you so much. Where can our listeners find and follow your projects? And do you want to shout out those things really quick for them?
Sure. So, the projects that I work on, are oracle.elixir.com is my personal stats website. My professional project is Shadow Analytics, or shadow.gg. you can find me on Twitter at Tim Sevenhuysen.
Nice. Okay, well, thank you again, and hopefully later on in the season, maybe we can have you come on and we'll do like a follow up of like, all right, here's what we said.
Here's 100 Thieves.
Here's how exactly Tim was right on every single thing, except for having the Team Liquid jersey up in the back. Other than that, man, flawless, and we thank you so much. Everybody else, thank you. Everybody else, we're going to be, I'm sure, streaming some more League gameplay this week so you guys can have a nice laugh at us. We've got some more stuff coming up. We're going to hit the holiday season, so there might be a little bit of a pause, but we're always around on Twitter, so you know where to find us, at 100 Talk Pod. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in, and we look forward to doing this again. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Miss you already. Miss you.